No one expected trouble when Staff Sergeant Luke Daniels rolled into Bella Vista on a quiet Thursday evening. The warm lighting, soft piano music, and scent of garlic and rosemary made the upscale San Diego restaurant feel like the perfect place for a peaceful meal. For Luke, this wasn't just dinner, it was a milestone. 2 years after losing both legs in an IED blast in Afghanistan, he finally felt strong enough to go out alone to reclaim a piece of normalcy. Dressed neatly in a button-down shirt and seated in his advanced wheelchair, Luke looked every bit the proud veteran he was. Beside him trotted Ranger, his loyal golden retriever service dog, wearing a bright vest clearly labeled medical assistance animal. Luke had made a reservation in advance, specifically requesting a wheelchair-accessible table. When he arrived, the hostess, a young woman named Emily, greeted him with a smile and began leading him to his table. But before they could proceed, restaurant manager Richard Banning stepped in from the kitchen, frowning the moment he saw the service dog. His tone was polite but cold. "Excuse me, sir," he said sharply. "We don't allow pets in this establishment." Luke blinked, caught off guard. "He's not a pet. Ranger is my service dog. He's legally protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act." Banning's jaw tightened. "We weren't informed of that when the reservation was made. I'm sorry, but our policy is clear: no animals." Despite years of military training that taught him how to remain calm under pressure, Luke could feel his heart pounding. "Sir, federal law protects my right to have a service dog with me in the public places, including restaurants like this one." But Banning wouldn't budge. "I don't want to make a scene," he said, his voice rising slightly, "but I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a fine dining establishment. Other guests may not be comfortable with a dog under the table." Other diners had begun to glance over. Luke, humiliated and furious, stayed composed. "I have a legal right to be here, and I confirmed accessibility when I called." "I'm not repeating myself," Banning said sharply. "Please leave before I call security." And just like that, the evening Luke had planned to celebrate his progress and independence unraveled into a moment of public discrimination. But unknown to him, seated just yards away, were 4 Navy SEALs who had been listening closely, and they were about to make their presence known. The atmosphere inside Bella Vista had always been carefully curated: soft jazz humming through the speakers, flickering candlelight on each table, and the gentle clinking of wine glasses beneath exposed beams. But that evening, all of it faded into the background as an uncomfortable silence crept across the dining room. Every pair of eyes was now drawn to the entrance, where Staff Sergeant Luke Daniels sat quietly in his wheelchair, facing down the restaurant manager who had just denied him service. His service dog, Ranger, remained calm at his side, a quiet sentinel amidst the rising tension. At a table near the window, 4 men in their 30s had paused mid-meal. Though dressed in casual slacks and button-down shirts, their posture, their alert eyes, and the way they instinctively positioned themselves facing the door made their military background unmistakable. They were Navy SEALs from Naval Base Coronado: Lieutenant Commander Mark Shark Ramirez, Petty Officer First Class David Tank Thompson, Petty Officer Second Class Carlos Viper Martinez, and Petty Officer Third Class Tom Ghost Chen. Ramirez had noticed Luke the moment he entered. Even in civilian clothes, there were tells only a fellow serviceman would recognize: his controlled breath, the slight scan of the room before settling, the quiet discipline in his movements. But what struck him most was the dog. Ramirez had seen service animals like Ranger in combat recovery wards. That wasn't a pet. That was a lifeline. The SEALs had heard every word of the conversation between Luke and Richard Banning, the manager. When Banning escalated from cold denial to outright hostility, raising his voice, drawing attention from other diners, Ramirez leaned forward, setting his fork down with deliberate precision. "That's enough," he muttered to his team. Without needing another word, all 4 men rose from their seats in unison. The sound of their chairs scraping against the floor echoed across the now silent dining room like a challenge issued. Other patrons looked up, sensing the shift. Something serious was about to happen. Lieutenant Commander Ramirez approached the front desk with calm authority, his teammates flanking him in loose formation. The tension in the air thickened as he looked directly at Banning and said, "Is there a problem here?" Banning blinked, clearly startled by the sudden appearance of 4 imposing men. "This doesn't concern you," he replied, trying to maintain control. This man, He gestured at Luke, brought an animal into a fine dining establishment. We don't allow pets. I've asked him to leave. Ramirez's voice was steady, but there was steel behind it. That's not a pet. That's a federally recognized service dog. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you're not only required to allow it, you're prohibited from denying access based on it. You're breaking federal law. Banning's face flushed. I don't care what kind of dog it is. This is my restaurant, and I decide what keeps the atmosphere appropriate. I have the right to remove customers who disrupt other guests. David Tank Thompson stepped forward, his towering build causing Banning to instinctively step back. No, sir, you don't have the right to discriminate against a disabled veteran. That man has a reservation legal protections and more courage in his little finger than most people have in their whole body. If you force him out, you're going to answer for it. Tom Ghost Chen added, and just to be clear, we're not asking. We're demanding you treat Staff Sergeant Daniels with the dignity he's earned. Luke still seated in his wheelchair. I looked up at the four SEAL strangers who had stepped in without hesitation. His voice was low but resolute. I appreciate what you're doing, but I don't want to start a scene. I just wanted dinner. Ramirez turned to Luke and gave a slight nod. And that's what you'll get. No man who's given what you have should be made to feel ashamed for asking to be treated like everyone else. Other diners had started to record on their phones. Whispers filled the air. That's a SEAL team, someone said. He's a veteran. The restaurant's image of upscale calm was unraveling not because of Luke, but because of Banning's unwillingness to back down. Banning, now visibly sweating, tried to recover. I'll call the police. You're all trespassing now. Carlos Viper Martinez stepped forward calm and unshaken. Please do. We'll wait here to explain to the officers exactly how you violated 80 law. I'd love to hear their take. By now, Bella Vista was no longer just a restaurant. It had become a courtroom, and the public was watching. What began as quiet discrimination had transformed into a full-scale stand for justice. Four Navy SEALs didn't raise their voices. They didn't threaten. They simply showed what it meant to stand shoulder to shoulder with a fellow warrior in his moment of need. Together, they weren't just a table of diners. They were a force that no manager, no policy, and no prejudice could ignore. And Luke Daniels, who had once feared he'd be turned away alone, now knew he didn't have to fight this battle by himself. The air inside Bella Vista hung heavy with tension. The once upscale hum of quiet conversation and clinking wine glasses had long faded. All eyes remained fixed on the confrontation at the front of the dining room, where Staff Sergeant Luke Daniels sat in his wheelchair, surrounded by four Navy SEALs defending his legal right to dine with his service dog, Ranger. Manager Richard Banning stood rigid, face flushed, one hand gripping his phone with white-knuckled uncertainty. Around the room, dozens of diners were holding up their smartphones recording the moment. The court of public opinion was now fully engaged. That's when a clear voice broke the silence. I'm an attorney, called out a man from a corner booth. Middle-aged, wearing a blazer over a loosened tie, he stood up with conviction. This is a direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. What you're doing is not only discriminatory, it's illegal. You could face a lawsuit and federal penalties. Heads turned toward him as murmurs spread through the room. Before Banning could respond, another voice chimed in, this time from an elderly woman seated with her husband near the back wall. Her voice trembled slightly with age, but carried a powerful authority. Young man, she said to Banning, my husband served in Korea. I've seen what war does to a man. You don't turn away someone who gave so much for this country. You welcome them. You thank them. She dabbed her eyes with a napkin. The silence that followed was absolute. Lieutenant Commander Ramirez gently placed a hand on Luke's shoulder. If you're ready, brother, now's the time. Luke nodded. He cleared his throat, steadied himself, and rolled forward a few feet, Ranger close beside him. The dining room, packed with well-dressed patrons, grew so quiet the buzz of the restaurant's air conditioning was suddenly noticeable. My name is Luke Daniels. He began, his voice calm but filled with quiet strength. I served with the 3rd Infantry Division in Afghanistan. 2 years ago, an IED exploded beneath my convoy. I lost both legs. I suffered a traumatic brain injury, and I lost 2 good men under my command. A hush swept the room. I've spent the last 24 months in hospitals, therapy centers, and support groups, trying to learn how to live again. Luke continued, It's been painful, lonely, and harder than any battlefield I ever saw. Tonight wasn't supposed to be dramatic. I came here to celebrate 2 years of survival and progress. He paused, blinking back tears. I just wanted a steak and a glass of wine. I wanted to feel like a man again, not a burden, not a project, not someone people pity or fear. Just normal. The emotion in his words hit like a wave. A few sniffles could be heard, followed by the sound of a glass clinking softly against the table as someone set it down with trembling fingers. I called ahead. I made sure the restaurant could accommodate my wheelchair. What I didn't expect was to be told I don't belong here, that my service dog, my medical equipment, was a disruption. He looked directly at Banning. I didn't come here to make a scene, but when you told me to leave, you weren't just turning away a customer. You were telling every veteran, every disabled person out there that we don't belong in places like this. Ranger sat quietly at Luke's side, his eyes locked on his handler, as if understanding every word. Luke drew in a deep breath. But you know what I'm not ashamed of how I look. I'm not ashamed of my dawing, and I'm not ashamed of my service. I wore the uniform with pride. I didn't fight overseas to be told I am not welcome in my own country. The room erupted into applause. Slow at first, started by the elderly woman, then rising like a tide. Diners stood to their feet. Some wiped away tears. Others clapped with reverent energy, a few placing hands over their hearts. Even the servers near the bar joined in their trays, forgotten as they watched a moment bigger than any meal service unfold before them. Richard Banning stood paralyzed, overwhelmed by the wave of support engulfing the man he had tried to remove. His mouth opened slightly, as if to protest or explain, but no words came. Luke looked around, visibly moved by the response. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he said. "Just respect. The kind we all deserve, especially those who've paid the price for the freedoms we enjoy." Ramirez stepped forward and spoke firmly. "This isn't about politics. This is about basic decency. This man earned his place here and everywhere else. The only question is whether you, Mr. Banning, understand what leadership and dignity look like." For a moment, the manager's face softened, his eyes flicking between the standing diners and Luke's resolute expression. But the damage was already done. The community had spoken, and their hearts were with the man in the wheelchair who had come for a quiet meal and ended up showing an entire room what grace under pressure truly meant. Manager Richard Banning, now visibly rattled, fumbled with his phone, stepping away from the gathering of applauding patrons. He ignored the stares, the murmurs, and even the pointed glares from several tables as he dialed 911. His voice, when he finally spoke to dispatch, was tight and defensive. "Yes, I need officers at Bella Vista restaurant. I have a customer refusing to leave, and now there are several individuals confronting me. It's turning into a situation." Less than 5 minutes later, the familiar sound of police radios crackled just outside the restaurant's glass doors. Two uniformed officers entered, Sergeant Monica Hayes and Officer Kevin Tran, both experienced, composed, and immediately alert to the atmosphere. The buzz of cell phones recording, the tight knot of tension still hovering in the air. And at the center, a man in a wheelchair with a golden retriever at his side, surrounded by 4 off-duty military men standing like sentinels. Sergeant Hayes approached the group and calmly asked, "Can someone tell me what's going on here?" Before Banning could interject, Lieutenant Commander Mark Shark Ramirez stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Commander Ramirez, U.S. Navy SEALs. This gentleman, Staff Sergeant Luke Daniels, is a disabled veteran who made a reservation, arrived with his service dog, and was denied service by this restaurant's manager in violation of federal law." Hayes turned to Luke and offered a respectful nod. "Sir, is that true?" Luke replied calmly, though fatigue was creeping into his voice. "Yes, Sergeant. Ranger is my service dog. He's trained for mobility and PTSD response. I called ahead and confirmed accessibility. But when I arrived, the manager refused to seat me because of the dog." Sergeant Hayes crouched to glance at Ranger's vest, confirming the clearly marked service animal patch. "This is a fully credentialed service dog," she noted aloud before standing and turning to Banning. "Sir, are you the manager?" "I am," Banning replied, trying to regain control of the narrative. "This is a fine dining restaurant. We have standards. I didn't know he had a service animal. I was trying to avoid disrupting the atmosphere for other guests." Hayes raised an eyebrow. Mr. Banning, the Americans with Disabilities Act mandates that service animals are allowed in public establishments, restaurants included. Denying access to a disabled individual because of their service animal is a federal violation. Banning stiffened. I didn't mean to break the law, but you did, Officer Tran interjected firmly. And this entire incident has been recorded by half the patrons in your restaurant. You're looking at legal consequences if you continue down this path. The crowd murmured their approval. Several guests nodded, some filming with tears in their eyes. The elderly woman who had spoken earlier whispered to her husband, "Thank God someone finally said it." Ramirez leaned toward Luke. "You good brother." Luke nodded faintly. "I'm okay, just tired." Hayes turned it back to Banning. "Sir, we're not going to remove Staff Sergeant Daniels. In fact, if anyone should be facing legal action tonight, it's you." Banning's eyes flicked from the officers to the gathered crowd, then back to Luke. His face had drained of color, his earlier arrogance now fully evaporated. In that moment, he realized the full weight of the consequences he'd invited onto himself, legal, reputational, and moral. I suppose I was mistaken," he muttered, forcing the words out like stones. "He may stay." No, Ramirez replied, his voice cool but unwavering. "Not just may, he has the right to be here. A seat at his reserved table. Full service. No conditions. No further humiliation." Banning nodded stiffly, then turned to the young hostess Emily, who had been watching nervously from behind the podium. "Please seat Mr. Daniels at his original table." Emily gave Luke a small, warm smile as she approached. "Right this way, sir." Luke maneuvered his wheelchair forward slowly. Ranger trotted beside him, head held high. As they passed through the dining room, patrons gave respectful nods, many placing hands over their hearts or offering soft words of gratitude. The Navy SEALs followed closely behind, resuming their seats as quiet protectors. The table Luke had reserved sat by a window overlooking downtown San Diego's skyline. The hostess helped him settle in, bringing a menu and a glass of water. For a moment, the clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation slowly returned, but the entire atmosphere had changed. The restaurant was no longer a place of silent indifference. It had become a space where dignity had been reclaimed. Sergeant Hayes approached one last time. "Staff Sergeant, if you need anything else tonight, you let us know. And if this establishment gives you further trouble, file a complaint with the Department of Justice. They'll be very interested in this case." Luke nodded. "Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate you coming down." She tipped her cap. "It's the least we could do." And with that, the officers exited, leaving behind a restaurant that had witnessed not just a confrontation, but a lesson in accountability law and basic human respect. Manager Richard Banning stood frozen for a long time behind the bar, staring out at the room, watching the man he'd tried to eject finally enjoy a quiet meal. For Luke Daniels, that dinner wasn't just about steak or wine. It was about being seen, being heard, and finally being treated with the honor he had earned. As calm returned to the dining room, Lieutenant Commander Mark Shark Ramirez leaned across the table toward Manager Richard Banning, his voice quiet but firm. "Mr. Banning," he said, "you've just been handed an opportunity not just to right a wrong tonight, but to lead real change." Banning, still rattled by the confrontation, looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this place could become something more." Ramirez continued. "Instead of being known for turning away a disabled veteran, Bella Vista could become a beacon for inclusion. What if you trained your staff on disability law? What if you hosted dinners to honor veterans? What if this place stood for something?" There was a long pause. Banning glanced toward Luke Daniels, who sat quietly eating his long, delayed dinner, with Ranger resting loyally at his side. The once divided dining room now watched with quiet reverence. "You'd help with that?" Banning asked almost reluctantly. Luke looked up, his voice steady. "I'd be proud to." That conversation marked the beginning of a transformation. Within weeks, Bella Vista partnered with local veterans organizations and disability advocates. With Luke's guidance and the SEAL's support, the staff underwent extensive training on ADA, compliance, trauma, sensitivity, and service animal protocol. Ramirez even brought in military counselors to speak with the team about invisible wounds and the strength it takes to live with them. 6 months later, Bella Vista wasn't just a restaurant, it was a community symbol. Every last Thursday of the month became Veterans Night with complimentary meals and recognition ceremonies. A wall near the entrance displayed photos and names of veterans who had dined there, along with a plaque inscribed, dedicated to those who served and continue to serve. Here you are always welcome. Luke Daniels, once humiliated for simply trying to enjoy a meal, had become something greater. He took to the stage at local universities, veterans centers, and national conferences, sharing his story not out of bitterness, but to teach, to remind others that inclusion isn't charity, it's justice. This wasn't about a steak dinner, Luke told an audience during a keynote speech. It was about being seen as a human being again. And thanks to a few good men who stood up when I couldn't, I found my voice again. The lesson here is clear. Respect is not optional. It is owed to every person who sacrificed, struggled, or stood up for others. When we choose compassion over convenience and courage over comfort, we shape a world worth living in. If this story moved you, leave a comment with your thoughts, and if you believe veterans deserve more than just words, hit that subscribe button to support stories that honor real heroes. Let's build a community that doesn't just say thank you for your service, but proves it every day.